Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. Welcome to another live stream. A little bit earlier than usual, but I thought I'd hop on this morning and comment briefly on this sharp rise that we've seen in the silver price. You can see here, courtesy of SD Bullion, got the silver price chart up more than 2.5%, up about 58 cents today. And we're going to talk about what's driving this rally in the price of silver. And it's just not silver, it's commodities across the board are up. We'll be looking at some of those charts here in just a moment. I just want to give you my thoughts on this rise. Now remember, you can buy your gold and silver at sdbullion.com right now. New customers can get gold or silver at spot by visiting sdbullion.com/news. So make sure you check that out. Now let's take a look at the data that was released today, which appears to be driving this rally. We have got the CPI data for June that was released just about 40 minutes ago. It came out at 8:30 and came more or less in line with expectations. We've got the CPI up 3% year over year, so it appears that the CPI is dropping. However, if you look at the core CPI, that's minus food and energy, that was up 4.8% year over year. So still well north of the Fed's 2% inflation target, but nonetheless, we are seeing inflation begin to ease a bit. Now, it's kind of interesting that you see inflation coming down, but the US dollar index on this data took a big hit, right? Sort of the inverse of gold and silver. So you would think if inflation is weakening or inflation is coming down, that would mean the dollar was getting stronger, but we're actually seeing the opposite. If we look at the 3-month chart here, you can see it's been dropping since the beginning of July, kind of trading flat since then, since the past 3 months, but now we're seeing it decline. And like I said, it's not just silver that's spiking up today. You've got crude oil, the WTI spot price for crude oil up over $75. That's a pretty significant increase. Silver, I think I got to refresh this chart to see the increase. Yeah, there you go. It's come down a little bit from the peak, but pretty good spike. Gold also up significantly on the release of this inflation news. So why? Why are commodities rising and the dollar falling on a lower inflation print? Well, we've talked about this many times on the channel before. It has to do with the anticipation of what the Federal Reserve will do next. Now, speaking of that, we can take a look at the CME FedWatch tool. And this is the odds, the target rate probabilities for another quarter basis point rate hike at next month's FOMC meeting. And you can see that's still pretty elevated, more or less unchanged on this CPI release, 91%. So markets still believe that next month we're going to get a rate hike. But what does this tell us that commodities are spiking on this inflation print? Well, it means that they anticipate that there's not that many hikes left. I mean, that's my interpretation of it. The Fed has been very hawkish. Jerome Powell telling us that we would have at least 2 more rate hikes throughout the remainder of 2023. However, this lower inflation data seems to be convincing markets that the Fed will ultimately cease their hikes relatively soon. That's why you see the dollar falling on this news and you see commodities rising. I mean, it's more of this bizarre dynamic where good news is bad news is good news, and clearly Fed policy is still the only thing driving action in these markets, or it's at least the predominant factor that is still determining where prices go. If you're tuning in, thanks for watching the live stream. Make sure you smash that like button. I do see, that guy saying hello in the chat. And I know this is kind of early, so maybe there aren't too many people tuned in. I can't see the actual numbers at the moment, but I just wanted to pop in here and comment on this because it's so telling when you see the precious metals spiking up on inflation coming down. I mean, it kind of gives you an idea of how crazy these manipulated markets have become and the sort of bizarre price action that you can get in markets that are driven by central planners. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about inflation as we look at these charts here, because I think that inflation may be done with its decline. There's a lot of talk about how the Fed is winning their inflation fight. 58 people watching. Oh, that's great. Thanks, Silverline. Appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. I see some people chiming in the chat there. One of the reasons is, let's look at this crude oil chart here. So we saw inflation cooling off in June, but if you'll notice, in June, we had much lower crude oil prices than we've got right now. I mean, for most of the month, it was under $70. This is the WTI spot. Now we're up to $75, a pretty significant move on this data release today. Commodities across the board getting bid up. Now, why is that important? Well, like I said, the core CPI, that's the inflation minus the volatile food and energy sector, is still up 4.8%. But the CPI that does include energy is down to 3%. A lot of that has to do with this reduction in crude oil prices, the fact that crude oil remained low throughout May and June. And now I think we're beginning to see that rise up. And it's not just me saying this. This is a headline from yesterday from Reuters. EIA, so that's a U.S. energy agency, the Energy Information Association, I believe, or agency. They cut their forecast for U.S. crude oil production this year, and they're forecasting that demand is going to rise. And this is coinciding with cuts by OPEC Plus, by Russia, by Saudi Arabia. They announced last month that they would be extending their production cuts through 2024. And Brent crude, so this is another spot price for crude, that hits $79 yesterday on further OPEC production cuts. So we started to see the price of oil ticking up yesterday. WTI was up to 74, and then on this week inflation data, we are seeing it continue to rise. So I do think that this is a sign with these production cuts, and also with the IEA, that's the International Energy Agency. They have forecast that demand for oil will be rising throughout the remainder of 2023 into 2024 due to increased demand in the Middle East and in China. And so I think as oil begins to creep back up for the remainder of the year, a lot of that downward effect on inflation is going to begin to play out. Now, of course, this will have, I think, some interesting effects on Fed policy. I mean, if the Fed is promising more rate hikes, even as we see inflation begin to come down, and we're anticipating that they're going to hike in July, even as we see inflation continue to decrease, then that could mean that as inflation rises as a result of higher energy prices, we are going to see perhaps an even more hawkish Fed. But ultimately, I think where this is leading us is towards, an economic disaster of sorts. If you've got rising inflation, rising energy prices, and an increasingly hawkish Fed as we head into the end of 2023, I do think that could lead us to a economic crisis of one sort or another. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to break next. But as we see crude oil beginning to head back up, and it's come down a lot over the past year. I mean, if you look at the one-year chart, you can see that back in July of 2022, you had WTI crude over $100. So the fact that it's down in the 70s today, you can see that is responsible for a significant portion of the disinflation phenomenon that we've witnessed so far. And so I think that as we wrap up 2023 here, we are going to see a higher inflation. I think we may see inflation bottoming here as a result of this energy situation. And of course, CPI, there's a lot of manipulation in these numbers anyway. The fact that the CPI has dropped to 3%, I mean, put it in the chat, anybody out there, if you've seen your cost of living rise only 3% over the past year. Prices have risen significantly more than the CPI reveals. And I mean, anybody who is just going through daily life in this economy, I think, is aware of that. But nonetheless, the market interprets these numbers to be accurate. They take these government numbers on their face. And so it's very interesting when you see inflation dropping and silver and gold, the price of silver and gold spiking up. It gives you some insight into where we may be headed next. If the Fed continues to hike, if they are as hawkish as they tell us, it may mean that we see a decline in the price of silver and gold, because I think the reason that they're rising today, again, is because when you get weak inflation, markets and investors, they begin to believe that the Fed may be bluffing when it comes to their hawkish forecast, their hawkish outlook for the rest of the year. But It's just another example of bad news is good news. If you were wondering why the silver price is up so sharply today, that's why. It's because of low inflation. It's because of these bizarro markets. I picked up some constitutional silver recently from SD Bullion. It hasn't gotten here yet. I'll probably do an unboxing for you when it arrives, but I'm glad I did when I did, because in markets like this, and with the amount of uncertainty and high inflation and out of control fiscal policy in Washington, and the fact that we have these bizarro manipulated markets, controlled, planned markets where the Fed policy, what comes out of the central bankers' mouths, and with investors believing that, what they do next is really the important thing. I just like to get into hard assets. I'm glad I picked them up before this spike up, but I'm going to continue stacking. It's very possible that if we do see inflation rising throughout the remainder of 2023, and I think that that's a real possibility, that this may just be a bottoming of the inflation. It's possible we could see the silver price fall. It's very possible. I've mentioned that in recent videos. And if low inflation means that investors, bid up the price of silver, high inflation may mean that it drops. But ultimately, I think the trajectory we're on here is towards a economic crisis, one in which the Fed will be forced to pivot. And it's hard to say. I mean, maybe investors, understand that. And that's why they're bidding up the price of precious metals. But just wanted to hop on here and give you my thoughts on this spike up in the price of silver on this inflation data. And time will tell. We'll see how this plays out. But in the meantime, I am going to continue stacking. So leave me a comment down below to let me know what you think. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I will catch you next time. Stay safe and happy stacking. Smart Silver Stacker, out.